What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Music with Mike. Today, I'm going to share with you a few techniques that you can use to add depth to your mixes. So before we begin, I want to talk to you about what I mean by depth. When we think of our mix, we want to think three-dimensionally. We can think of height as our frequency spectrum, width as our stereo panorama, and depth as our dynamics. So let's begin by creating something like a totem pole in the center of our mix. The low end is our sub-information. Above that is the kick and bass, the clap and snare, synths, guitars and vocals, hats, cymbals, percussion, and whatever other elements we decide to introduce into our mix. Many elements may share the same space on the frequency spectrum. Luckily, we have two other dimensions to help us spread these elements out so they don't clash unpleasantly. We can use effects like panning, stereo wideners, and the Haas effect to begin moving elements off of our totem pole so they're in their own little space away from the elements that share the same frequency range. In addition to sending things to the left and right, we can also push them to the front or to the back. We can do this in a few different ways. We can do this simply by turning the volume of the track up or down. We can decrease dynamic range with compression to pull a sound forward. We can also use compression or transient shapers to turn down the attack and send our track to the back of our mix. In addition to this, we can add depth to a sound by using an effect such as reverb or delay to create the sense that the sound in question is in a small, medium, or large space. Now that we have an idea of how we can add depth to our mix, let's talk a little bit about return tracks. A return track is not like your other audio and MIDI tracks. It does not have a dedicated lane for audio or MIDI data. Return tracks are specifically made to create a signal chain that can process multiple incoming signals from your other audio and MIDI tracks together. For example, I can create a return track that has a reverb on it. I can dial in my preferred settings, and once complete, I can use the send knobs on my audio tracks to send a portion of a track signal through that return track. I can dial it into taste. The audio signal from that channel is processed separately from the original track. This is a great way to add effects like reverb and delay without weakening the original signal by processing it directly. The perks of applying effects this way means you don't have to open separate identical instances of the same effect on multiple tracks. It creates a sense of cohesion among the processed signals and also saves us by consuming less CPU. That being said, when using effects with the dry-wet option, you will want the effect that is on your return track set to 100% wet. If it is not, you will also be introducing a duplicate of the original dry signal, which can cause issues with levels in your mix. So today, I'm going to walk you through a project I'm currently working on and show you the different ways that I used return tracks to thicken, create depth, create width, and even add movement to my mix. Now, before I begin, I want to remind everybody that production and mixing is as much an art as it is a science. There's no single right way to do any one thing, and this often causes arguments among people online. So just remember, there are a million ways to do the same thing, and everybody needs to discover what works best for them and their music through trial and error. If for some reason you take issue with one of the techniques I used today, drop it in the comments and let us know why. And while you're at it, consider liking and subscribing. Now let's dive in. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at this progressive house track I'm working on. I have, as you can see, 7 return tracks. I have a room reverb, a medium reverb for my instruments, a medium reverb for my percussion, a slap delay, side distortion, parallel compression for my drums, and mids distortion. And I'm going to go through these one by one. I'm not going to go super into detail about all of my settings and whatnot, but I just want to kind of give you an idea of what you can do to play around with adding depth to your mix with all of these different effects. All right, so I'm going to get started with the room reverb. It is the first return track I have here, and this is generally where I start when it comes to adding effects with return tracks. Room reverbs are a simple way to add some slight depth and liveliness to your drums and other major elements, and it kind of puts them all in a space, like this is almost like a band playing. This kind of makes them sound a little more cohesive. I'm just going to start by playing a dry section of my drums with no effects on them. Pretty straightforward, 4 on the floor. Doesn't sound very lively, sounds kind of bland. I'm going to add my room reverb, and we're going to hear a subtle difference. My clap and my hi-hats are going to sound like they're in a small studio space. Sounds much better. So let's take a look at my room Verb. I have Valhalla Vintage Verb as my reverb of choice, but you can do this with anything. In the end, your settings are up to you, but generally when you're working with a room reverb, if there's an algorithm like this here, I have set to room. I have my pre-delay all the way down. My dry wet is all the way wet. My decay is 0.2 seconds. Anything under 0.5 is usually considered a good starting point for your room reverb, and then everything else here can be done to taste. All right, so next let's talk about my medium instrument reverb. This is a longer reverb than the room would be, a longer decay, a pre-delay, and I applied this to my instruments in my breakdown, my pads, my choirs, strings, things like that, to give it kind of a more grandiose sound. It sounds like it's in a big room. I'm gonna go ahead and play a little bit of the breakdown without it, and then I'll add it in, and then I'll even solo it so you can hear what's happening in the background. Here it is without it. So some of those instruments already have reverbs or delays. They maybe it was a preset I used or something that had one built in, and I didn't bother to turn it off because it sounded good. But I went and added this to make it sound even bigger. Let's give it a listen with my medium instrument reverb. I'm gonna go ahead and solo it. So this is what's going on behind the scenes. It definitely makes it seem a little more lush, a little larger, and it just kind of fills out depth in the mix. So you can apply this to a lot of different instruments in a lot of different ways. This is how I choose to do it in my breakdowns. You can experiment and do whatever you want with your medium instrument reverbs. So my third return track is another medium reverb, but specifically for my percussion, my hats and claps. I wanted them to sound like they were in a bigger space, but I didn't want it to sound as big as the space I put my pads and strings and chorus in. So I'll go ahead and open up my Verb here. You see I cut off all the low end because we don't need any of the low end. I'm using Valhalla Vintage Verb again. Even though there's an EQ built in, I always like to use the parametric EQ after to shape the sound how I want it. Again, our mix is all the way wet. This one has a pre-delay, shorter decay time than the other one. I'm using a plate instead of a chorus space, and everything is done to taste. So I'm gonna go ahead and play my drums without this medium reverb, and then I'm gonna go ahead and add it in. So it definitely sounds like it's in a much bigger space than the room reverb offers, but smaller than the chorus space that I put my breakdown pads and strings in. This can get really muddy sometimes. In this case, it's not, but some people will even throw a sidechain on these kind of reverbs to keep them from clashing with the kick. But for now, I'm happy with the way it sounds. So my fourth return track is a slap delay that I applied to my arpeggio to make it sound a little brighter. It's an immediate delay, unlike a ping pong delay that fades off into the background. It happens immediately and stops just as fast. It's more like a quick echo. Just like reverb, it kind of adds depth, making it sound like it's in a smaller room. So I'm going to go ahead and play my arpeggio, and I'm going to A-B the slap delay so you can hear the difference when it's on and off. So right now it's off. So you can also hear that I have a delay on my arpeggio already. That one is coming out of Serum. I decided to keep that on. Normally I would send it to a return track, but I thought it sounded really good the way it was. And even when I added the slap delay, it just made it sound better in my opinion. So I'm going to go ahead and solo the slap delay so you can hear what it sounds like without the dry signal. And then I'm actually going to move the dry wet knob to the center so you can kind of hear exactly what it's doing in a more exaggerated fashion. So you can hear it's super quick. It disappears as soon as it appears, and it adds just a nice tone to our arpeggio in here. And all of these parameters, like I said, with any of this, it's all done to taste. There is no one right way to do this. So my fifth return track is my side distortion. And now I'm going to be completely honest, this was my first time trying something like this. I had seen it somewhere else, somebody had done something like it, and I wanted to do an experiment and see what I could come up with. So this was pure trial and error. It just happened to, in my opinion, sound good when I was done playing around with it. I routed my hi-hat, my clap, and a bass layer into this return track, and what I did was use a QuickHaas effect to split the signal and delay one side to give it more stereo information. Then I added a Fabfilter Saturn with some heavy saturation to make it nice and crunchy. Then I took it, this is where it got weird, I took an EQ8 and I EQ'd out the entire mid information, and then I kind of corralled from 200 to 10,000 hertz on the sides. So I'm going to go ahead and solo the layers that I'm sending through my side distortion, and I'm going to play them without. And now with. Without. And with. And now I'm going to solo it. So this is what it's doing. It's just adding this extra beef to the stereo image for these instruments. And in the context of the mix, I think it sounds pretty good. Now, if you're a professional engineer and you're looking at this signal chain and you're saying, oh my God, what did you just do? Leave me a comment and let me know what I did wrong. So my sixth return track is just a simple return for parallel compression for my drums. So parallel compression is when you route a signal through a return track and you compress it very heavily to the point where it's almost just the sustain and the body of the signal, in this case the drums, and very little of the attack. And once you have that heavily compressed signal, you blend it into the original signal, and this kind of thickens your drums. So I'm going to go ahead and play my drum track without the signal. Now I'm going to go ahead and solo my return track so you can hear how heavily compressed these drums really are. Yeah, you can really see that compressor working down here, squashing the signal until it's almost all sustain. So now when I play them together, I'm going to A-B them first without, and then I'm going to go ahead and add our parallel compression in. So you can hear it adds a little thickness to our drums and makes them sound more full, take up more space, and be more forward in our mix. So my seventh and final return track is just a simple distortion plugin, and I EQ'd it down to just from like 150 hertz to a little over 10K. I just needed a little more beef from some of my mid-range instruments, like my arpeggio. I wanted them to take up more space because right now there's not a lot going on in this mix, and when I add vocals I may choose to come back in and take it out, but until then I wanted it to take up a little more space and sound a little more full. So I'm going to go ahead and play the soloed version of this. I think it's just on my arpeggio and maybe my hat and clap. We'll see. I guess it's just on the arpeggio and the hat. So I'm going to go ahead and play the track, and I'm going to A-B the distortion. It's going to be very difficult to hear because it's very subtle and it doesn't do a whole lot, but in the end, all of these things together kind of fill out the mix. So let's give this a listen without my mids distortion and then with. So now I'm gonna play a little portion of this track with none of my return tracks on, and then I'm going to go ahead and play the same portion with all of the return tracks on, so you can hear just how much of a difference these make. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and turn all of my return tracks back on. And I want you to listen to see if you can hear the difference, if you can hear the depth. So see, using these return tracks and techniques like this could be the difference between a good mix and a great mix. So that about wraps things up. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, make sure to drop them in the comments. Also, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time,